All right. Good morning. Welcome to my Jewish Learning's weekly Daf Yomi review class. We are somewhere in the middle of Tractate Yevamot, and I'm Rachel Shinerman, and we are delighted to be joined this morning by Rabbi Elliot Goldberg. More tea, please. Go ahead, Rabbi Goldberg.
There you go. Good morning. Good morning. More tea, please. That's good for Masachet Yevamot. Actually, one of the daily doses, I think we did that. Hi, everybody. Last time I was with you, we were comfortably at the end of Seder Moed and enjoying the familiar territory of Jewish holidays. And you've had a couple weeks in Yevamot here in our weekly highlights, but this is my first time with you. And I don't know about you, but Masachet Yevamot sometimes just gives me a headache. It's complex. Oh, I'm seeing some nods from some faces on the screen. We entered a different world of the Talmud. So I have a few general notes and then some framing, and we're going to look at a little text this morning. If you've been here with me, I'm taking a different approach this morning. You'll give us the feedback if you like it this way. We'll see. I just want to say, what saves me in Masachet Yevamot, this is like the free advice section, I guess, the unsolicited free advice. What saves me in Masachet Yevamot is having a reference guide that I can turn to when my head gets all twisted around by the Gemara. And everyone has their favorite, but I find in some ways the most complicated piece of Masachet Yevamot is keeping what's happening in the Mishna straight. And the Gemara's conversation of the Mishna is easier to follow if you have the Mishna down, which sometimes it's the opposite, where the Mishna is the easy part, and then the Gemara gets harder. So I have my screen. Hang on, I'm gonna unblur my background. My go-to help for Mishnah Yevamot is the Art Scroll Mishnah series. This is the visual aid. I'm from the 20th century. It's the Art Scroll Mishna series. They have smaller paperback ones. This is a hardback. It's really detailed. The commentary really clarifies the Mishnah, and of all the different, charts and family trees and things, I find these the easiest to follow. I'm a few weeks ahead in Daf Yomi, so I'm around page 30, but I moved my Yevamot from Art Scroll down from where it's stored in our library to the desk at which I work, because I turn to it all the time. And I would just advise, finding that good source. I like this because the pictures make it all clear after a little reading and a couple cups of coffee or tea or whatever, and I think that's worthwhile. And if you're like me, using the Koren, with the Steinsaltz English, the Noe edition of the Talmud, there's great resources there too. And I discovered something. I wish my free advice there is do some flipping just with your fingers for pages ahead, and sometimes you find a helpful chart. When I got to the end of chapter 2, I discovered on page 160 and 61 of the Koren edition, there's a 2-page chart that shows it's a family tree with all the forbidden relationships between a person and all their relatives of 6 different generations, like the ones that are biblical and the ones that are rabbinic. And I got to this page, I'm like, oh my God, why didn't you put this before the chapter? I really wanted to look at this. And then I got to this chart and said, oh my God, this is what I've been needing in one page. And there it is. So in the Koren English edition, which, if you're using Safaria, the text is there, but the pictures are not. It's a really helpful diagram of forbidden relationships between between a man and his relatives of all sorts of generations, but so clarifying for Mishnah Yevamot. Anyways, if you have other helpful resources that you've been using for Yevamot, put them in the chat, and we'll group source this. Someone says, why would we care about all these forbidden relationships? We might not need them for our personal life, but to unpack the Mishnayot that talk about which wives exempt their co-wives and which ones don't, knowing who you're allowed to marry and who you're not allowed to marry will be helpful. We're going to jump into that in a minute, but that was a great question. I lost the chat's flying today, so I lost who asked that, but thank you for asking that.
I put the Amazon link for the Art Scroll Mishnah to Tractate Yevamot in the chat for those who want to look at that specific book. And please, we do welcome your advice on other resources that have been helpful to you.
Thanks, Rachel. You're one up with me. I just had the visual aid. You're from the 21st century. You have the link too.
I'm working in the background here.
There you go. All right. So here's what I guess my first reaction to Masechet Yevamot is like, what is this phenomenon? And, and why is this so complicated? And what are the rabbis doing here? And before we jump into a text for this week, part of, I think we're still early on enough in the Masechet, which goes, 100 plus pages, I think 120, that we're going to be in it for a while. So framing is still helpful. And what it occurred to me is that what's happening in Yevamot, well, it's, for me anyways, and from the nods I got before, maybe for you, seems a little strange. It might not be as strange as we think it is if we change our reference point. So I don't know about you. I'm having a spoiler alert conflict, but I watched the Game of Thrones. I love the Game of Thrones books. I watched the Game of Thrones series, and it actually occurred to me that if you watched Game of Thrones or many TV serial dramas, the situations in Masechet Yevamot might not be as strange to you as you think they are as you read the Talmud. So let me share my screen and tell you what I mean. I would say this: if you haven't seen Game of Thrones and you're planning on it, there are a few spoilers here that there's one secret that comes in like season 4 that I'm giving away. But it's been enough time that I think the spoiler rule allows me to use this as a Talmud aid. All right, I'm going to pull up. Oh, here we go. I'm going to pull up a slideshow. Here we go. All right. Here's a family tree, not with the pictures from the Art Scroll or the Korah. And you might, if you're a Game of Thrones fans, you might recognize this family. It's at one point the royal family. King Robert Baratheon and his lovely bride, Cersei Lannister, and they have 2 sons. They have a daughter also, but for purposes of this illustration, we just need the 2 sons, Joffrey, the oldest, and Tommen, the youngest. And Robert Baratheon dies. That happens early on. That's not really a spoiler. And because he has children, he dies. His wife becomes a widow. His children become orphans. But we don't need to do anything with Yevamot because there's no issue with Yevamot. He has children, so that part goes normally. But later, their eldest son gets married. And it turns out there's the tragedy, if you know, that at the wedding feast, the groom dies. This is the scenario that frames Masechet Yevamot. We have a husband who has died childless. And so what happens? His wife is supposed to marry his brother to continue the family line. Now, in Game of Thrones, it's not about continuing the family line. It's about continuing the alliances between families that keeps peace in the kingdom, sort of. But that's the scenario of Yevamot that we're dealing with. And it might seem odd, but there it goes. It was, main piece of a major television program. And I just threw this in because we're dealing with different relationships. It turns out that here's Lancel. He's the brother of the woman who marries the surviving son, right? Of the Levirate marriage. He becomes engaged to the mother. But it turns out, though, the brother of your son's wife or the mother of your wife's husband is not a forbidden relationship, both in Game of Thrones and in the Torah and the Mishnah. So while there are personal issues between these two folks, there are no issues both in Halakha and in Game of Thrones. It does get a little more confusing on the television show for people who know, which is that the children of the king aren't really the children of the king. They're actually the children of the queen and her brother. That comes into issues of mamzerut in Jewish law, not in this week, but I thought since we had the image here, it might be helpful to mention there are other complications that show up in the show. Anyways, so that's one scenario. When we get to the Mishnah that shows up this week, we can go to a different scenario in Game of Thrones. I don't know if you know Daenerys and Jon Snow, but these two characters have a budding romance, which carries on for a few seasons. This is where the spoiler alert comes in. And everyone thinks, as you're watching the show, that they're going to become a couple, but we learn secretly, here's the family tree, that it actually turns out that Jon Snow, whose origins are uncertain, is the nephew of Daenerys Targaryen, and then they become a couple that becomes a little complicated. And now I'm going to shift for a minute from the show and use this family tree to talk about a Mishnah that we see this week in Masechet Eruvin and how it's different from the first Mishnah that we've been studying, up until we switched to Mishnah 2. So we have this scenario in the show where it turns out where there's a nephew and an aunt who become romantically involved. And according to biblical law, it's forbidden for a person to marry the sister of their father, right? It's a forbidden relationship for you to marry your aunt. But if, how could it possibly be that you marry your aunt? Well, just watch Game of Thrones and you'll see how Jon Snow ends up getting involved with his aunt, which they're unaware at the time that they are a couple. But if it should happen that he were to die, I'm going off script here. If he were to die, that without children, if they got married and he were to die, this could be a levirate marriage situation, and his brothers would then have the levirate marriage obligation to marry his wife, who also is their aunt. Now, in the Mishnah that we learned this week, the key piece is, since it was forbidden for Jon Snow to marry Daenerys Targaryen from the beginning, and it's a forbidden relationship, it's also, right, the laws of levirate marriage don't apply for this marriage, and since they were never supposed to be married in the first place, and because of that, she does not exempt the other wives that he might have, which he doesn't in the Game of Thrones, from the levirate marriage obligation, right? And that whole piece is different from the first Mishnah, right? Because the first Mishnah, which we spent the first couple of weeks on, talked about certain relationships. If the husband dies, the wife is not only exempt from levirate marriage, but any other wives that the husband might have is also exempt. But in this scenario, in our Mishnah that we have today, this week, because the original relationship of husband and wife is closer and actually forbidden in biblical law, she doesn't exempt the co-wives. So because there was a marriage that was forbidden, unlike before where the co-wives are, everybody's exempt from levirate marriage, in this scenario, if there were co-wives, they would not be exempt from entering into a levirate marriage. But I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a minute. So I don't know if that helped. It was interesting, but the idea with this second Mishnah that has its complication. But some of what I think for me, the Game of Thrones analogy does is to say that, well, maybe this whole endeavor of Masechet Yevamot is not as strange or foreign as we think it is, because right, we see it in our television dramas or maybe in some of our novels, right? The scenarios of different different people getting married and different people dying and all the different complex relationships that we've been trying to sort out seems strange, but it's in our literature, it's in our culture, it's in places that even have very little to do with, right, Talmud and the rabbis and Judaism, Jewish practice. I would say, right, Game of Thrones is a good exemplifier of something that is far from, right, Jewish culture. But many of the relationships that are depicted in the in the literature are also, in this television show, are also depicted in the Talmud. All right, I'm seeing a whole series of really good questions in the chat about a whole array of the details. See, I see that everyone's really engaged. What I'm learning from the chat is we as a group are really engaged in Masechet Yevamot, because these all drill down to some of the details, and you have a lot of great questions, and I can already see there are more questions than we have time to dig into all of them. One difference, as someone just quoted about, right, polygamy, right? In Game of Thrones, polygamy is not kosher, so there aren't co-wives. That's why I didn't have co-wives in my TV example. In the time of the rabbis, there was still polygamy. I don't know about, I wasn't able to research the halakha of Game of Thrones, but I love the Game of Thrones. Like the fan websites for Game of Thrones were great because they had all these good charts to teach about Yevamot. Like if I was still teaching in Jewish high schools, like we'd have a whole Game of Thrones Yevamot lesson. Anyways, so here we go. So I want to go back to some of the questions, right? In the original Mishnah, someone asked about this. In the original Mishnah, the issue was there are certain categories of women that you're allowed to marry, but for one strange family reason or another, if you were to die without children and the brothers fell to these women for levirate marriage, there would be some kind of complication in terms of who's permitted to marry whom, with the surviving brothers marrying the widows. And because of that, not only are they exempt themselves from performing levirate marriage, all the other co-wives, or rival wives, depending on what translation you're using, are also exempt, right? The new Mishnah that we started this week added a new list of women where the relationship between the husband and the woman is the familiar relationship is closer in that the original marriage is somehow suspect or forbidden. And because of that, it's almost counterintuitive. Because the marriage itself is forbidden, it doesn't play into the levirate marriage scenario. So should the husband die, it's the woman, the particular widow is exempt, but all of the co-wives are not exempt, right? Because while there's still this familiar relationship that's sharper, it's not necessarily true for the co-wives with the brothers, and because of the forbiddenness of the original marriage, it negates the exemption of the leverage marriage from the co-wives. That, in a nutshell, is the difference between the new Mishnah that we started this week and the old Mishnah that we've been reading in the Masechet so far, and the difference between the two can sometimes cause a lot of confusion, and that's why I think the Mishnah commentaries are very helpful in terms of, because if you can sort out for yourself the difference between the first Mishnah and the second Mishnah, you're in a good place to follow more the conversations that the Gemara is having about both of them. Okay. I'm seeing a whole run.
Sometimes I think, Rabbi Goldberg, that American culture has sort of conditioned us to think that the ideal of the 1950s is how it always was before the 1950s, right? By the time we get to the 1950s, and we have this idea of a nuclear family, a mom, a dad, 2 kids, a picket fence. The 1950s itself sort of portrayed that is the ideal family structure and the only societal structure that has ever existed. But that's patently not true. That's a fiction of the 1950s. And in fact, family going back was it was very different and much more complicated, as we can learn from Game of Thrones, which, full disclosure, I've never seen.
Right.
And also from reading the Bible and the Talmud. It was just very different. And it is hard to enter into a world and understand what were their assumptions about family, how were families made and why.
Yes.
And what were the ground rules? Because it's obvious to them, because they're living in that world, so they don't tell us the ground rules for making family. And so we have to sort of figure out from these exceptional cases and these discussions what the
Right.
ground rules were.
That's true, and you said it there much more succinctly than I did. You know, the reason why it happens, I like Game of Thrones. I didn't want that to dominate, and I saw some. You know, I want to talk about Talmud. I have a text I want to go to in a second, but I do think by looking to literature or other places that depict different family structures in a world where those relationships make sense in the context of the world, it does help us understand, you know, or enter into the rabbinic world that seems different. And my great drawing from that analysis was about just really about, you know, we have examples that can help us understand the Talmud by looking at other places that show different models of family structure. All right, I want to go back. I'm going to share my screen again and go back to sharing my screen, because I do have one text I want to bring up today on the family. I'm going to go to the next slide here. Because what I love is in this week something that's in the middle of all of this. We're introduced to a difference in halakha about certain case of rival wives being permitted or prohibited, and we see this nugget of Talmud in the middle of Yevamot. Another thing I like about Talmud in general is as you're digging deep into the details of a particular fine points of a particular halakha that might seem farther from the day-to-day reality. There's a nugget of Talmudic wisdom or Talmudic practice or Talmudic something, and we find one this week. So it brings us into a different realm a little bit. So the text says, although Beit Hillel prohibit the rival wives to the brothers and Beit Shammai permit them, and although these disqualify these women and those deemed fit, Beit Shammai did not refrain from marrying women from Beit Hillel, nor did Beit Hillel refrain from marrying women of Beit Shammai. So what's interesting is here, there's a divide in the Mishna about some particular cases that we don't have enough minutes to go into the detail of, but it's enough to know that there's a certain cases where Beit Hillel says certain wives are prohibited and Beit Shammai says they're permitted to people, and you know that would mean there are marriages that Beit Shammai allows that Beit Hillel thinks are illegitimate marriages. But even though they have this different approach to this matter of halakha, it didn't keep the people from these two camps, right? The individuals from the two different ways of thinking about life, from Jewish life and living, from marrying each other and joining into one family, even though they had some differences about family rules, right? And actually it says, furthermore, with regard to all disputes concerning the halachot of ritual purity and impurity, where these rule that an article is ritually pure and those rule that it is impure, they did not refrain from handling ritually pure objects with each other, right? As Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel frequently used each other's vessels. So it's not just in matters related to Yevamot, but also about ritual purity. Certain vessels, right? One house declared pure and one impure, and vice versa, but they still were able to share, right, utensils and vessels with each other. And things that could be a divider were not. And I love this text, and while some of the stories that the Gemara tells about it or the discussions it has challenge this notion and say it wasn't maybe as rosy as the Mishnah projects it, I love the vision that's presented in the Mishnah here that says Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, two rival parties with different views about a lot, right? Similar views about most of the principles, but about some serious points of Jewish law, they differ. It didn't stop them from building families together, and it didn't stop them from sharing vessels, which meant, that they ate at each other's houses. Or, in the workplace, they could use things together. And I love this message for a couple of reasons, right? And for those of us in the United States and North America, right, part of the culture challenges that we're having are from people who, right, we think about, I don't know, the blue states and the red states, right, the political divide that's made Thanksgiving dinners or, Pesach Seders complicated for families who can't talk about current events because the political divide is so far. It's really hard, right? And in some ways, Hillel and Shammai represent, right? It's not the same piece, but right, it's a division in rabbinic society between two different ways of thinking about how the world should be organized. But they still were able to come together as a family and still were able to interact. So on the culture side, I think about, this model that Hillel and Shammai, that this Mishna projects, and what we can learn from it, in our day-to-day lives. But I also think it's important in their Jewish lives as well. And for me, this particular Mishnah is an inspirational piece of my own practice. And not everyone adopts this practice, but I'm going to share mine. Right? There's not only one way that people keep kosher. Of the kosher keeping people, and I have a lot of friends who keep kosher in some ways differently from me. But based on this Mishnah, right, I've adopted a similar practice. If I'm going to someone's house and they tell me they keep kosher, I accept their kashrut because I want to be able to share vessels, right? And I want to be together. And it might be that there's a particular rule where I'm lenient and they're strict, or there's another rule where they're lenient and I'm strict. But for me, going to be a guest in someone's home, some of the particulars about the individual practices are less important to me than the ability to have community together. And that's inspired by this Mishnah and the conversation in the Gemara that we read this week. And I think that sometimes we use our differences and practices within the Jewish community as ways to divide us. And I don't think that has to always be the case. And there are ways that we can look to the Talmud for examples, like we see this week, to overcome some of those things for the sake of being able to be one bigger community. And buried in this week and in Masachet Yevamot is not only the conversation about wives and co-wives and levirate marriages and chalitza, but also this whole conversation about what does it mean to be a Jewish community, and where do we bend individual practices for communal needs, and how do we think about differences in practice, and how firm do we stick to our differences as opposed to, about certain rituals as opposed to certain other values. So I wanted to share that. I hope the part one was illuminating some for those who are still trying to get Yevamot straight, and that it wasn't too much jargon for those who aren't familiar with the cultural reference I brought today. And I hope there's some inspiration from that second text that we encountered this week, and a lovely Talmudic discussion about it. And thanks for being here.
I thought that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai text was really something too, that they would even marry children that according to them would be mamzerim. Would be, there's no good translation, but probably bastard is the usual one, that they would do that, which would, that was really actually quite incredible. And I love your modern day application of it. That's really lovely. That's really lovely.
It was inspirational to me, that text. Anyways, thanks everybody. I appreciate it. For those who I saw, there were so many really good detailed questions about Yevamot. The challenge of Yevamot, especially in this highlight form, is going to be like, it's so intricate and so technical. It's going to be hard in this space to answer all your great questions. But from those questions, I see like you guys are so engaged in the study of this Masachet, and it's a hard one. Just know that. It's hard for all of us. Before you came in, we were talking to Rachel and I were talking about the the challenge of the daily email and both the writing and the editing and the understanding of the Gemara to make sure we can share something out. So we're in it with you.
Yes, please feel free if you didn't get your question answered in class today to send it to me by email. We're also always interested in your feedback. We are always trying new formats and new things here, and we appreciate your engagement and your feedback. Absolutely. We learn a lot from you, and we will keep going forward. We got 100 more pages in this tractate. So there will be lots more to talk about. But we need to wrap up for today. So thank you so much, Rabbi Goldberg, for trying to get our feet on the ground about this tractate. And thank you to all of you for being so engaged with us. And we'll see you very soon. Bye, everyone.